Hello, and this is round 2, or part 2, I should say, of the standard purchase agreement in the state of Virginia with a RAIN contract. We're going to jump right into page, let's see, where are we? Page 6, section 10, prorations and escrow. All right, so part A of this two-part section is if it's new financing, cash, and all property taxes, insurance, rents, interest, and you can read this, it's either going to be one of two things. You're either going to have new financing, which you're going to check A, or if it's an assumption, which I've done a few assumptions in this market, then you would check B. But most of the time it's going to be checking A. And then if it's an assumption B, then there's going to be a couple of choices, which either they're going to be prorated or they're going to be current on their taxes, insurance, etc. But that's a whole nother chapter in this discussion. Let's move on to the loan types. If you saw my previous video on the pre-approval process, you have already had your client talk to a lender or two, and they know what type of loan they're going to get. So now we're going to go through, and there's several different types of loan. The first one, starting in number 11, is VA, FHA, or conventional financing, or cash, which I love. Cash is king, right? And then under that, A is the HUD, FHA, or VA financing. That is where you would check if that is the loan product that the buyer is going to get. And in that, you can read that paragraph, but basically in the middle of that paragraph, you're going to put the contract amount that the home has to then appraise, or the purchase price of that amount. So that's what you're going to put that amount in that box there on page 6 in the middle, if that is a VA or FHA product loan that they're getting. Then moving on, if they decided to go with conventional financing, which we briefly talked about in the previous video, then you would choose B. Or if they're going to go with cash, my favorite, king, then there's two choices. You're going to choose box number C, cash, and then there's going to be either they do or do not wish to have an appraisal. This would be an independent appraisal, whereas with a financing type, VA, FHA, or conventional, the lender will order the appraisal and the buyer will pay for that through their financing product. With cash, that buyer will have to then find their own appraiser and then pay for it independently. So that's important to know when you're talking to your client, a cash buyer. Do they want to have an independent appraisal done? All right, well, let's move on to the next section, which is page 7, appraised value. This is always interesting because appraisers are made of their own thing. I don't even know what to call them. In this market, you really can't talk to an appraiser. If you're the listing agent, they're going to want to have access to the property, and they're going to want to be able to have 3 comps from you as the listing agent. And as the buyer, you're not going to really have much interaction with them. Let's just say that for some reason the property does not appraise. The lender will let you know, as well as your client, about the appraised value. So that's a little bit about appraisal. Under number 12, property condition. This is very important because let's just say that you did a walkthrough of the property and maybe you noticed that the carpet was dirty, maybe there were items in the home, maybe there was something that really stood out to you that other than at a home inspection that you might need to have fixed or replaced or repaired, that your client really felt strongly that this was part of the contract, that they wanted it to be fixed, replaced, or otherwise. You would add this in that property condition, item number 12. All right, so then moving on to underneath that paragraph, this is an important box to check because buyer has, box number 1 or box number 2, has not physically inspected the property in person prior to execution of this agreement. If they have not seen the property, let's just say that you have a out-of-area client that is relocating to the area and you did a FaceTime video, or you did, maybe you just did a video and then you sent it to them and they've agreed that they wanted to move forward. Then you have to do a secondary no physical inspection addendum, which would be an addendum to this contract, and have them sign that with this. So let's make sure that we check the right box for that. Moving on to number 13, inspection, repairs, treatment, and cap. So this is very confusing, and a lot of people do not understand this. The cap for a seller is for termite and appraisal required repairs. Typically, if it's left blank, that would be 1% of the purchase price. So on a $250,000 house, the cap would be $2,500. So if the seller paid termite and moisture repairs and there was appraisal required repairs of more than $2,500, then it would become a renegotiation. This is a little bit tricky, so you really want to make sure that you understand how this all comes into play when you're negotiating a contract. But for right now, let's just leave the place blank and leave it at 1%. You can be strategic when you're negotiating an offer and put, like, say, 0.5%, or if you know that the house is under termite moisture contract, if you're negotiating to try to win an offer, and be strategic on that blank. But for right now, let's just put 1%. Appraisal required repairs are subject to the cap. That's number A. And then B, termite and moisture. You know, one of the things that I would love to encourage you to do is to have lots of conversations with the listing agent and find out, does the seller have a termite and moisture contract? If they do, then in the inspection reports, you can ask the seller to provide the report and pay for it, because they're already paying a company and they have the company under contract. If you don't know that, or if you haven't even asked those questions, then a lot of times you would want the buyer to choose and the seller to pay, or you can have the buyer to choose and the buyer to pay for the report. That is the middle, the first blanks, and then in the middle you can also ask for the shed, a garage, any outbuildings or anything like that. That's the next line, any other additional structures. And then you will ask for how many days it's going to take in order for them to send you the report. Let's just say that you've asked for a 30-day closing window. So you really want them to have this done, because you're going to have to submit it to the lender and the title company and everything within the first 7 to 10 days. So understanding a calendar and a timeline for termite moisture and the closing and all those things on a 30-day calendar is very important. All right. Hope you're enjoying this. Let's move on to the next page. That would be page number 8. And that has to do with the treatment, termite and moisture treatment. Oh, one more thing at the top of the page, the termite and moisture cost for that. That's the last line at the very top of the page. In this area, and if you're watching this in 2025, usually the report costs no more than $150. Then number 2 and number 3, treatment and repairs, you can see that all subject to the cap. Moving on to line C, drinking water and septic. Most of the time in Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, most of Hampton Roads, it's city water unless you're in a rural area, and then it's on a well and septic. And then you would want to choose how the well water is going to be tested. That is either the buyer or the seller to obtain at walkthrough an inspection of the water treatment. And then those are the choices. And then same thing with the septic. So that is a lot to learn. Well and septic is very difficult to kind of traverse in your initial contract. So that's going to be a lot of questions that you're going to want to ask the listing agent again. Is it on a well? Have they had the well tested? Have they had the septic pumped out? When was the last time the well was tested? Or when was the last time the septic was pumped out? Those are just some good questions to ask. But anyway, again, those are all subject to the cap as well. So moving on to walkthrough. If you've made it this far, congratulations, because your client is super excited. They are buying a house and they're going to go to walkthrough. One of the most important things to make sure is that the listing agent has all the lights on. You want all the utilities on in the property so that you can test everything. And that is what box number A or B says, who will be responsible for the utilities. Typically in this area, the seller is responsible, and so you would check the seller box, is responsible for all utilities on during inspection and for walkthrough. All right, so contingencies, that is a lot. There are a lot of contingencies out there. And one of them is for if you're buying a condo. So if you want to buy a condo, then there's a common interest condo documents, which would require you to get a separate addendum on how you would receive those condo documents. And so you're going to ask, is it or is it not in a common interest condo disclosure? And then you'd have to choose how your client would receive those. And then if it is or is not, that's the top of page 9. And then you just can read through that, because then there's several different ways of receiving those documents. It's pretty self-explanatory, but if you have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to me privately, because there are quite a few boxes that you need to check on how you're going to receive them. Moving on to page 10, this is property inspection, or what we call a home inspection. In a hot market, we don't typically waive a home inspection, but you can waive the home inspection. That is choice A, or choice B is you can desire a home inspection. There's a lot of things in between both of those where you can have a home inspection for informational purposes only. And that's also, there's some things that you can also write in that can be creative, as far as if you were to say, well, I want a home inspection, but if there's only the systems that are broken, then I would like those fixed, or a dollar amount. There's a lot of creative ways to write in a home inspection when you're in a hot market. And then what we call EIFS, which is exterior insulation and finish systems. This what you would find in the MLS. If this either has EIFS or it does not, and then you could check NA. And then lead-based paint for a house built prior to 1978, then they would have been considered to have lead-based paint. I used to always say to my clients, just don't let your kids eat the walls. I know that doesn't sound very good, but lead-based paint is just something that would be a possibility in the structure if it was built prior to 78. And then if it was built prior to 1978, then they do have an opportunity to have an inspection. This inspection, I've never had any of my clients have one of those, but there is also a separate addendum that goes with this. So anyway, moving on to the next page, we are up to page 11, and this is going to be all of your items that are going to convey. And again, you would go back to the MLS, and also a lot of times you're going to want to review what was in the property when you were there. Sometimes I like to take a photo of what's in the kitchen, maybe what's in the home, just a quick little video so you can reference, because a lot of times maybe the listing agent might have forgotten to check, is it a gas stove? Is it an electric stove? Is it a microwave? Is there 2 refrigerators? Is there maybe is there a wine fridge? Is there a generator? There's all sorts of things. There's pool, there's dock equipment, all these things. You want to check all of the things, the blinds, the hardware, trash, receptacles, gas logs, pool covers, pool equipment. Be very specific, because you want to check those boxes, and then there's another box for additional items that you want to notate. Maybe there's a shed, maybe there's other pool equipment and things like that that you want to make sure that convey with it. So the more detail that you can write in that additional items notes, the things that you've seen, especially with homes that have different or unusual items that maybe go with the property. All right, so moving on to confirmation and disclosures. That's not really anything we really need to kind of go over in detail, except for the fact that as you move further down that paragraph, you're going to talk about how you're representing your client. And this is going to go back to your buyer agency agreement, and how are you representing the client? Are they a customer? Are they a client? And you would choose one of those boxes as to how your representation looks. Is the listing agent a full service? Are they a client, a customer? You can read through those items 1 through, I think it's 6, and then determine from there how you're representing. Are you also doing dual representation? In the state of Virginia, we are allowed to also do dual representation. So anyway, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered within that. Moving on to item B of that is aircraft noise and potential crash zone disclosure. That's kind of interesting. In Hampton Roads, as you know, is a military area, and we have a lot of jet noise, which is, we love our jets. But anyway, in that you'll find there's 2 blanks. One says aircraft noise zone. You're going to fill that in from the MLS. And then the second part is the crash zone. That's mostly in the Virginia Beach area, Chesapeake area, as you get into Hampton as well. And then some of the outerlying areas do not require that. In Virginia, it is a residential property disclosure state, which means that it's a buyer beware state. And so there will be a disclosure signed by the seller and uploaded in the MLS that you will find that your client will have to review. That basically says, for the most part, that the seller has no knowledge of anything wrong with the property. Moving on to agency disclosure, we talked about that in your buyer agency agreement. Megan's Law, number E, you can go over that with your client to make sure that they do their own due diligence. Mechanics liens, the title company or the attorney that you have hired is going to make sure that all the mechanics liens are removed from the property, hopefully at the time of work done, and that during the time maybe there's some work that was done for home inspection and things like that. It's super important that you get all of those invoices paid at closing as well, just to make sure that there are no dangling mechanics liens. Square footage is always an approximate. And then moving on to building, pending building and zone violations. They can always check out the city websites. And then moving on to, I think, number 17 right now. This has been one of the biggest things that has changed, I think, recently is the brokerage fee as a buyer agent. This is something that you and your client have had a discussion about, hopefully already, and you would fill in the percentage on line 1 and or line 2, the exact sum of what you're going to be paid or how you're going to be paid in line 2. And then just moving on to if they default in the agreement, you can read that. There's some things that need to be done if they decide to default, which I think you need to explain to your client that this is a legally binding contract that they're getting into. And it's super important for them to understand the ins and outs of what they're getting into. Moving on to page 14, dispute resolution. This is a state where we would go to mitigation first. And so like if they decided to default on the agreement, they would have to go to mediation first and then move on to suing one another if they had to do that. And I think in conclusion, that really breaks down the last of the page 14. Moving on to page 15, there's a little box in the middle that has the buyer or the seller sign that this has been digital signatures. And then if you flip over to page 16 and the final document, you're going to have the buyer's agent and your selling firm agent signatures and the buyer's signatures, and you are done. You've completed the primary standard purchase agreement. There are quite a few additional addendums that we will go over, as well as an escalation clause, but I hope you found this helpful. So thank you so much for hanging in there with me. This is a lot of information, and I hope this helps. Have a great day.